When I first considered coming back to my YouTube channel to upload regularly again, one of the first ideas I had for a video was about one of my personal favorite shonen manga, Jujutsu Kaisen. Around that time, My Hero Academia had just finished recently, and JJK was also now on its way out, so you'd think that this would be a time for celebration, right? Wrong! It was a hellscape out there, just pure devastation everywhere. But what really brought about this reaction? Well, let me back it up a bit first. Originally, this video was only going to be about Yuji's growth throughout the story, specifically how I felt that it could have been better if it were more evenly spread out throughout its duration, rather than majorly in the beginning and majorly in the end, with a rather lackluster middle. But then I realized that this problem didn't stop at just Yuji. It was an issue with a lot of the story as a whole, as in a lot of the story beats that happened, especially in the last stretch, would have been better off with either more setup or just straight up happening earlier than they did. So long story short, my biggest peeve with the story was just the plethora of setups that either didn't pay off at all, or took too long with no in-betweens to be as impactful as they could have been. So this led me to the idea of making the video about JJK's pacing instead, until the announcement of the last 5 chapters dropped, and an entirely different, but always prominent problem caught my attention instead. One that made me finalize my idea for this video: the fandom itself. Now, like I said, I had problems with the story just like anyone else could. Some that I was really disappointed with, in fact, but I took that in stride and still very much enjoyed what I was reading for the most part. My opinion on the manga as a whole didn't flip turn due to these pitfalls. I'll make it clear though that if you or anyone else does have more of an issue with it and more strongly dislikes it, that in and of itself is perfectly fine. That's not the problem. My problem really lied with a certain archetype of fans, quote unquote. The type to constantly switch up on the series itself depending on the popular opinion. When a chapter dropped, it had to be either peak or trash, no in-betweens. And I dare not say mid either, because we all know at this point, when someone says that something's mid, they're saying it's ass. It was never supposed to mean that, but here we are. Now this brand of toxicity definitely wasn't something that started with the JJK fandom. In fact, there are a plethora of older fandoms that I see issues similar to this in, but JJK was just a great and widespread recent example of it. So this all got me thinking about different brands of toxicity I commonly see in fandoms that I'm personally a part of, and I finally locked down what I wanted this video to truly be about. So while the main and biggest talking point of this video is still going to be JJK like I originally planned, I'm also going to talk about 2 other fandoms in particular that, in my humble opinion, all 3 of these have different brands of toxicity. Except for one commonality between all of them. Shippers, man. I saw what the Voltron fandom did. They're crazy. And a huge disclaimer here to say that there will be manga spoilers for both JJK and My Hero right up to the end of the series. So if you care about spoilers and haven't read those manga yet, I will put up a spoiler alert at any time that there will be some, so you can skip past it if needs be. So I used to be a regular old lad, just reading my chapters week to week, chatting about it with my friends, and avoiding spoilers from anywhere that I could. I stayed mad vigilant on that stuff. Hell, I was barely even aware of the existence of JJK leaks until one fateful day, the drop of chapter 236. I remember waking up that morning and seeing my timeline filled with people saying stuff like, "If you value your life, run from the JJK leaks today. It's everywhere, it's spreading like wildfire. Save yourself before it's too late." So I was like, damn, okay, point taken. And I muted any words and hashtags related to the chapter. But somehow, some way, I hopped back on a few hours later and got flashbanged by someone dropping the most devastating panel in the chapter with no spoiler filter, no buzzwords that I would have known to mute, not anything that could have saved me from this. And I just had to hug that. I was pretty miffed about it for a little bit, but eventually I just threw my hands up and said, well, I already know the biggest part of the chapter. I might as well just look at the rest of the leaks now. and that was the last day I remained a non-spoiled fan in JJK. I fell into the trap of seeing those leaks before those leaks saw me for the rest of the manga's run. And you know, there were some issues with the community even back then, most obviously not knowing how to shut the hell up about spoilers, but another one rose into prominence as the series went on, and it's the same one I mentioned before, in fans, or in some cases, fans, being hyperbolically reactionary as hell about the manga. But not from the actual chapter, no. It was from reactions to the leaks. Hell, sometimes even reactions to the reactions of the leaks. Very often, I would see people make a big hoopla about what seemed like a plot hole, or that something went unexplained when it was right there in the story already. But because they didn't read the actual manga themselves, and all their info was gotten secondhand, they never came to know that. And then there were the types that would theorize things and be a little bit more pissed off than they probably should have been when they didn't come to be. Like, it's one thing to theorize and be miffed that you were wrong, because that's completely normal, but these guys would suddenly throw the whole manga in the trash because they didn't happen. Like, to throw an example at you, you'd be amazed at the amount of people that thought the merger was actually gonna happen. Like, do they remember what conditions had to be met for the merger to happen? That means everyone lost and died, people. Read the manga! But to cut these people a little bit of slack, I almost can't blame them for thinking that would happen, because the villains in JJK were in such a generational run that they almost made it feel like it was impossible for them to lose. There's a reason why a lot of people said the villains had plot armor in the story rather than the heroes. The rest were typically ones that thought a certain someone was going to be revived. And I'm just going to go on a little side tangent here, guys. And I partially say this as a man with Yuji as his #1 favorite character in the series. Gojo is not the MC. For years, I had to deal with Yuji's side character and bagless allegations, and most of it was because of this admittedly great man's existence. Like, I know the story itself rides Gojo like mad, because it couldn't say anyone's the best at anything without saying, except Gojo though, can't forget Gojo, no siree Bob, but y'all gotta calm down. Like, did y'all really think that Gojo was gonna beat Sukuna? The side character beating the main villain of the series? Like, sure, I didn't think he was gonna die, but let's be honest with ourselves here, guys. And now, while a lot of Gojo fans are a tad bit unhinged, they pretty much had only one thing to go off of for the rest of the Sukuna fight, and that was hoping he'd revive himself, which, honestly, was more funny to see unfold than anything else. What actually ticked me off was when we started getting to the ending chapters, and like 80% of the issues I saw people have with the chapters was not enough Gojo. Like, sure, that was basically a series-long thing, but it was somewhat in jest before, and it started becoming a hard criticism from some people as the story neared its end. Now, in all fairness, something like a short scene of them visiting his grave like they did with Megumi and his sister would have been nice, but Jesus, we were getting tons of flashbacks of Gojo even after his death, even one in the last chapter itself. It is not the end of the world here, guys. Like, in the very last chapter, Gojo himself is basically like, hey guys, I think we've had enough Gojo around here, and I want you, speaking to Yuji, to grow in your own way rather than mimicking me. And I still saw people saying they needed more Gojo in the ending chapters. And this is actually one of the other major issues I saw with the fandom. And you see, I fooled you into thinking this was just a rant. No, it was a segue the whole time. Because a lot of people just hyperfixate on one aspect of the series and write it off as complete trash when it didn't bend completely to their will. For all the lover boys and girls out there, it was typically just not getting to see Gojo exist. Geto didn't even have to be mentioned most of the time, honestly. Everyone knew that boy was dead as hell already. But they would focus so hard on Gojo alone that when he's not part of the story, they just tune out entirely. Like, it's one thing to have a favorite character and be miffed when they're gone, It's another thing to completely shut off the story whenever they aren't on screen. Or I guess on page in this case. But surely it can't be enjoyable to read a series this way, right? But, don't think that you muscleheads are off the hook either, because I've seen some foolishness come from that side too. It may not have ever reached the horrors that Gojo fans reached, but they could be just as annoying, if not more so due to them typically being the louder voice out there. These are the guys that only care about the aura moments, about what's peak or what's trash, the type to only care about the fights while dismissing the more dialogue heavy chapters for the entire run of the series. Now, being completely honest, I do lean into this side more than the shipping side, cause I'm not typically that big on shipping, and hey, it's a battle shonen at the end of the day. Of course I'm gonna wanna see fights. It even birthed some of the most hilarious memes and trends that I've seen come out of a shonen in a hot minute, but where it started losing me is when people determine the quality of the characters based on how well they fought or if they even fought at all. The agenda memes were a funny time in history, but it's one thing to joke around about a character being chopped because they got mollywopped in a fight. It's another thing to say that the character themselves is ass because they couldn't step up to the plate. And probably the three most notable examples of this that I can think of are with Yuji, Megumi, and Kashimo, each for slightly different reasons. First off with Yuji, I mean, he was getting slandered for years by this point, and that didn't just start with the last arc. In fact, the last arc is what reversed that slander against his character, because now he's strong and has a bag, and to these guys, having a bag means being a good character. But let me reiterate, I do think a lot of aspects of Yuji's character and powers were handled poorly in terms of the pacing, but I never once thought he sucked as a character just because he wasn't that much notably stronger post-Shibuya and pre-Shinjuku Showdown, or that he got less screen time for a while to give other side characters time to shine. He stayed my number one for a reason. Megumi, on the other hand, actually picked up the brunt of the slander in the absence of Yuji's, mainly due to the hilarity of his constant attempts to summon Maharaga, and the notion from Gojo that he had the potential equal to or even greater than Yuji's, only for us to never really see that come to fruition, resulting in his popular moniker, Potential Man. It also really didn't help his case when Sukuna took over his body and immediately showed far greater mastery over his own ability. But counterpoint, that is literally the king of curses. I think he's going to be able to pop off a little, but that doesn't stop it from being funny though. This got more and more intense as the story went on, most notably with Yuji's first attempt to reach Megumi's soul. Megumi was understandably absolutely devastated both mentally and emotionally, both from having to witness firsthand the murders of both his sister and mentor with his own possessed body, and the mental boom he probably experienced from the multitude of unlimited voids Sukuna used him as a soul body shield for. So he didn't respond well to Yuji's declaration to bring him back. This immediately led to Yuta getting packed up and the rest of the raid being able to exist at all, and Megumi got slandered to hell and back for this. Like, yeah, it was pretty funny when people were saying it in jest, but as is the case with many aspects of the story and its characters, those jokes quickly became serious criticism against his character for many. And then we've got Kashimo, who probably holds the world record for the greatest fall off in public depiction in the shortest span of time. Cause in less than 2 chapters, this guy went from being in talks of being amongst the strongest and the coolest guys around to a complete fraud, the waffled one, and a femboy for some reason? Like, they started calling this guy farmer level. Like, this guy used to be seen as one of the greats and ended up being simply reduced to this. He did have a fairly nice post-mortem moment with Sukuna, but it was completely overshadowed by his lack of performance, for better or for worse. A lot of these things, when kept fairly light in nature, were perfectly fine. Theories aren't always going to be correct, ships aren't always going to come true, and our favorite characters might just get their ass beat sometimes. It happens to the best of us. But it's the fact that the aggression and negativity are much more likely to be widespread, mixed in with the many misconceptions that people gained about the story, usually because they only read from leaks or watching TikToks over actually reading the chapters, that led to this storm that we saw begin to brew and grow over time until it became a full-on typhoon. When one person spouts something overly aggressive and derogatory about the story, it causes a chain reaction of people parroting the same things, which leads to really lackluster discussions, because people like this aren't usually saying things that are formed with their own opinions, just what they see other people say about the story, and those people probably got their info from leaks anyways. This definitely doesn't mean that your opinions can't be changed by the words of others, because that's a perfectly normal reaction to new and agreeable information being presented to you. But a lot of people don't try to form an opinion for themselves at all, purely adopting the popular, or in some other cases extremely unpopular, hyperbolic statements of others. And for JJK, this really came to a head when the very last chapter dropped, and it was almost entirely due to the leaks that were shared that day. To those that might not know, the most regular JJK leaker, Miyamura, had been taking a break for a while around the time of the last few chapter drops, and so other leakers picked up the slack to varying degrees of quality, and the worst of that decided to rear its head for the very last chapter. What amazing timing. These leakers decided to share only 5 or 6 pages of the entire chapter, including the very last one, with very poor translations, and it presented it as the only pages of the entire chapter. Now, I wasn't awake when these initially dropped, but I woke up that morning and fell into the trap myself, assuming that this was all there was for the last chapter, and even as a hard JJK defender, I was feeling incredibly disappointed. I did state in my initial tweet that I was in disbelief that this could really be everything, so I would wait and see, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that maybe this really was it. And everyone everywhere was up in arms saying that JJ fumbled the bag immensely and that this was the worst manga ending in history, and for once, I actually couldn't fully disagree. That is until later that same day, when the actual full chapter dropped, and I, at least, changed my tune quite drastically. The ending chapter is actually one of my favorite chapters in the entire story, with me getting to enjoy our OG trio goofing off again, which, slight tangent here, I also don't think that Nobara's death was handled well at all in the story, but that didn't stop me from enjoying the gang back together again, and seeing some nice character moments between Yuji and Gojo, and what was likely the highlight for most people, the post-mortem dialogue between Sukuna and Mahito. But not everyone changed their tune like I did, and under normal circumstances, that would be perfectly fine. But the issue is that the damage from those leaks were already done. Many people already tuned out and didn't even bother to check out the actual chapter afterwards. Or hell, some might not even know that it actually came out. They might still be under the misconception that those few pages we saw were actually the full thing. Videos were already put up, TikToks were already spread, reels about it were already far too abundant. And once again, a misconception became the most widespread info, and the series and author caught flack for things that were entirely the fault of the people not being patient and reading things for themselves. Now, I could spend all day rambling about JJK in many different aspects, but I'm gonna shift gears here and talk about our next fandom, because this is supposed to be about multiple fandoms after all. So let's talk about My Hero Academia. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning, the My Hero Academia manga ended fairly recently, and it was an interesting time in the fandom, I gotta say. Like, I can't lie, a common thread with me in these situations is having fun with all the memes that they spawned, even if they come from twisting the truth a bit for the agenda. But there was still a serious, vitriolic reaction to the ending once it dropped, and many people were left disappointed. Now, unlike with JJK, I wasn't on the leaks for My Hero, so really all I was seeing were the reactions to it filling my feed like crazy, and there was one general sentiment that was shared. Oh, this is ass. Every time I saw something about the chapter, it was just pure hatred for what they had read. It sounds a bit similar to JJK's, doesn't it? And I couldn't just ignore the waves of hate that I saw. So when the official chapter dropped and I read it for myself, I went in with the expectation that it would be ass, and it was actually kinda nice, in a vacuum. It was a cute ending even if I didn't get to see everything that I wanted come to fruition, in a vacuum. Initially I was like, you know, I can see where some people are coming from, but overall it wasn't anywhere near as bad as they made it sound. But then I started to reflect on how the story was going for the last stretch, and later on saw some more in-depth talks and videos from some people on why it was so disappointing, and my opinion shifted. While my opinion on the last chapter itself stayed relatively unchanged, it was the remainder of so many unresolved and disappointing story beats that happened in the last stretch that weren't fresh in my mind as I finished the chapter. Many plot points that were completely unfinished, or choices that felt counterintuitive to what the story laid before it, and things that just felt like rather odd choices in general. All of these formed in my mind later on, based on things that I simply didn't think of immediately, or ideas that I hadn't thought of at all that others brought to my attention. Because you see, I made an informed opinion of my own based on both my own reading and reflections, along with the informed opinions of others. These were the discussions that I wish I could have saw more of on JJK's side of things, even when it's about calling some parts ass, because I enjoy seeing different perspectives of people that have actually read what they're complaining about. But even with this new perspective in mind, I was still confused about the level of hatred I saw before I read that last chapter. Even now, with my slight disdain for the direction that My Hero took, I still felt like those initial statements were just a little blown out of proportion. That's when I was able to point out that there were basically two general camps that spread all this venom around. Once again, the leak readers, and this time, the villain sympathizers. Now, because I already went over the point of leaks and misinformation with JJK, I'm not going to rehash this point for too long. To make a long story short, apparently when the leaks of the chapter first dropped, it was, once again, translated poorly, which led to the notion that Class 1A basically disowned Deku as they grew up and became pro-heroes, while Deku remained a teacher at UA High, seemingly Urarakaless at that too. So this led to popular memes of Deku having no game, no bag, and no friends at the end of the story, typically portraying him as a McDonald's worker.
I'm still heroing, Kachan.
Really?
Yeah, I take the money I make from McDonald's and I buy flash grenades, smoke bombs, knives, and I patrol the streets. You know, keeping it plus ultra. But you know, minimum wage, you know, it's getting hard to pay rent. I could really use some money right now. Do you remember in middle school when you and your friends were bullying me and you found my hero notebook? You told me if I really wanted to be a hero, I should take a swan dive off the building and hope to get a quirk in my next life.
Yeah, Deku, I was 13, man. I'm sorry about that.
I think you were right.
These were admittedly pretty damn funny, but once again, there were a lot of people who weren't joking around and took this misinformation as legitimate fuel for their hatred towards the story. And then, just like JJK, by the time the actual chapter and translations came out, the damage was already done and couldn't be properly mended again. A shame that the same problem happened to two different manga's endings in rapid succession, huh? A bizarre timeline we're in right now. But now I have to speak about our other camp of vitriol for the story, the villain sympathizers. And now this is a bit of a broad term to label them with, but let me give you a quick rundown of who these people usually are, because they aren't just people who simply understood how the villains got to where they did. No. These people are built different. Typically, these are the kinds of fans who completely excuse any and all of the villains' actions due to their rough upbringings, detest the heroes as a whole for allowing the issues that create villains to exist, absolutely despise any heroes who did any wrong but strive to make a change, and my apologies for this, but this is simply what I've typically seen, they're usually also shippers, I'm sorry. Now by the end of the story, all the villains are either figuratively cooked, like Toga, or literally cooked, like Dabi, except for Spinner. Not the ending I would have expected them to get, but I guess it is what it is. To most, it would have maybe just been a point of contention amongst points of contention with the story's message as it went on. But to these types, it got wild. Like, I've seen it go as far as for people to call Horikoshi homophobic, transphobic, and endorsing of abuse for demonizing the abuse victims because of this. Crazy labels to drop out of nowhere, but that's typically how these types operate, and they're among some of my least favorite people to interact with when it comes to discussions because they just have no concept of nuance, only black and white. I also find their minds to be so strange because, like I mentioned before, they despise any heroes who did any bad before and tried to turn things around. Most namely Bakugo and especially Endeavor. You cannot bring this guy up around these types because they go crazy. Now don't get me wrong, Endeavor's sins are terrible and far beyond anything Bakugo did. Like, it's not even close. And you don't have to like either of these characters, but these people hate redemption arcs for characters like that because they seem more realistic and have more relatable kinds of sins, like familial abuse and bullying, and they let that hatred completely write off these characters as bad and claim that Horikoshi or anyone else that finds them interesting to be endorsing of bullies and abusers. I find it rather ironic because you'd think that the people who sympathize with these serial killers, who have plans for mass genocide mind you, and want to see them become better members of society wouldn't be completely dismissive of other people who did wrong and want to do better. But these guys tend to make a distinction between the two, typically by baiting the villains for having sad backstories, bonus points if they exhibit symptoms of mental illnesses or are part of a minority group, race-wise or sex-wise. Now don't get me wrong, I wanted better for the villains too. I think most people did, and we can easily see how they got to the places that they did. But just like Todoroki said to Dabi, no matter what other people did to them in the past, it was their decision to murder those people. They decided to make those poor choices, not anyone else. I can still root for these guys to somehow turn their lives around despite their heinous actions without condoning their past and current actions. It's exactly why so many other people actually find Endeavor's arc to be so fascinating. They didn't excuse what he did, and this is especially shown through Natsuo in the story. Endeavor himself knows that things will never be the same, having constant dreams of his family having a happy dinner together, but he's not at the table with them. Despite knowing all this, he still tries to make a change for the better, and that's what so many people find to be fascinating about him. The key difference that I've seen between villain sympathizers and Endeavor fans, however, is that Endeavor fans acknowledge the wrongdoing that he did and don't try to excuse it. They know he was a messed up individual, but recognize his willingness to do better regardless of that. But villain sympathizers typically use their sad backstories as a complete defense of how they turned out, excusing all their crimes because of the horrible things that happened to them as children. I think the best example of this that I saw was with none other than Himiko Toga, cause she grew up in a claustrophobic environment with terrible parents who never tried to guide or understand her at all, until one day she just snapped and started going on a spree. Horrible things to happen to a child, and you can see why she'd end up loving the League so much for being the first people to accept her, but like, guys, she still killed several innocent people. Completely understandable to feel sorry for her, I know I did, but she's not completely absolved of all crimes because she had a poor childhood. We don't just excuse going around tearing people up because she's a little delulu. That's not how things work. And funnily enough, even though she died at the end, I think most people agree that she actually got the best ending out of anyone in the League. She finally found someone of good influence to accept her as she is, and did one good deed in return at the cost of her life. I know a lot of people can relate to her story. Not one-to-one, obviously. I sure hope none of you guys were sucking the blood out of birds as kids. But not everyone had parents that were supportive of them, and may even be ostracized from them for being different. And I think that's why this resonated with a lot of LGBTQ plus fans, and I legitimately understand that. That's probably why it's harder for them to demonize her in any way. But we've gotta start making that distinction between fiction and reality, guys. Relating to characters like these is perfectly fine, but you shouldn't let that completely cloud your judgment, both for characters you love and despise. I think many of you will find that there are many more doors to fun discussions with people if you just learn to be a bit more nuanced in your talks. Okay, that was a longer tangent than I meant to go on, but enough with the sappy talk. I think it's about time we move on to our last fandom, the one that I'm the most active in as of now, the Sonic community. At least on Twitter. Now, I've already mentioned this in some of my previous videos, but I always heard the talks of Sonic fans from since I was a wee little lad, but I never really ran into them myself for a long time because I wasn't really in any Sonic circles despite being big into the series from before I even started kindergarten. The most constant talk I'd hear in my teen years was just passing comments from Mr. Aaron Hansen himself, saying that Sonic Twitter absolutely hates his ass. I never opted to fact check that, so I thought he was just exaggerating for the sake of the joke, because I couldn't fathom what there was to hate, really. Sure, he'd make some snide comments, but they never really hurt me even as a Sonic fan myself. It wasn't until recent times when I started using Twitter myself, and eventually running in the Sonic circles, that I saw what he meant myself. And these were recent tweets too, referencing their hatred for the man and the perception he supposedly gave Sonic games at the time, all these years later. Now I get it, if you're a person who's more sensitive to people who speak the way that he does about Sonic, you don't have to like the guy, but I just figured that at some point you gotta wrap it up, right? And let me say right now that I am not speaking about all Sonic fans here. A lot of the fans I interact with are a lot of fun and a joy to talk to, literally being the reason that I opted to come back to YouTube in the first place. But there are some detractors, I'd say. Donkey seems to have a similar reputation to Aaron among this group, which, unlike with Aaron, was a complete shock to me because I genuinely couldn't understand what he could have done or said to upset any of them. And I still don't, really. My first exposure to it was in reference to his Sonic Adventure video that he uploaded a few months back as of right now, with a lot of people preemptively being defensive over the game and aggressive towards Donkey. By the time I came across these tweets, I had already watched the video, so I was beyond confused, because he didn't say anything overtly bad about the game. It wasn't even a review either, just a little joke video, but these peeps were pissed. It was also in the replies to that tweet that I was made aware that his Sonic Frontiers video was also infamous among this group, another one that confuses me personally, to the point that people were ready to be up in arms about his video on Shadow Generations before they even knew it'd be a thing, and then still finding something to be upset about despite him being entirely positive and having fun through the whole thing, finding issue with him being confused that the game was as good as it was, despite the reputation that most recent Sonic games have for being a little janky. These were my first personal interactions with what has become a famous word amongst Sonic Twitter, toxic positivity. Toxic positivity is essentially the notion that fans are too accepting of anything and everything that's churned out to them, while demonizing any and all criticisms towards said media, not even all negative in nature. These people tend to be overly defensive of even the most legitimate of criticisms, and are usually very heated about it when it's completely unjustified, much to the disdain of anybody who wants to engage with the series beyond just, this thing good. And like I said, it's not even always something that should be perceived as negative, just pointing out little details or voicing their opinion on different aspects of the series, typically about the characters or stories. So I can completely understand why so many people I've come across are just completely tired of these kinds of people, because they are quite loud at times, unfortunately. However, I have to turn it back around on the other side of things as well, because a lot of the people on the initially receiving end of these flame wars aren't always as innocent as they claim, and end up using the term toxic positivity as a catch-all defense or even offense against anything. with some just looking at anybody who has fun with things that they think are bad as being the problem with the community and blaming them for any future poor game releases. Now, before I go any further here, I want to preface this by saying on both sides of things, I do not condone harassing people or sending them death threats over simple opinions, even when it's a little negative or annoying. They should never go this far, but unfortunately, they very often tend to. Now, like I said, there are still issues on the other side of the coin where people just paint others as toxically positive to try and mask their flat out toxicity by writing them off as shills. And full disclosure, I can't speak for how prominent this specific brand of people are, because I don't usually hang around those circles, but I see them leak out into my feed every so often, or under comment sections for other videos, much to my disdain. What I do see more often, however, is what I call the Sonic Twitter cycle. Basically, it starts with someone sharing an opinion, not necessarily negative in nature, but they word it in such a poor and annoying way that it makes you want to disagree, even if you do agree. Then people jump on that tweet, not usually for the opinion itself, but for how annoying or whiny that they sounded, usually hitting them with the quote, "Sonic fans are never happy." Then things escalate into a flame war, usually with the terms toxic positivity and negativity being flung around, no matter what the original subject was, unfortunately typically ending up with people being harassed or sent death threats. Then most people go back to their respective niches in the fandom, sometimes with a few offhand tweets about it from some people, and then the cycle repeats over and over and over again ad nauseum. While this isn't the end-all be-all for discourse that happens on there, you'd be shocked at the amount of times that this exact thing happens, and so many people just ride for the side that they usually ride for, while disingenuously writing off the people on the other. We're doomed to repeat this cycle until people finally realize what they, and the ones that they ride for, might be doing wrong. So until everyone can learn how to behave, I'm banning all Amy discussions. Stay away from Amy discussions. It's truly a shame that the commonly worst part of a lot of series aren't even the series themselves, but their fans. There are so many people who can use the term Sonic fans or My Hero fans by themselves as insults because of the notorious reputation that we have, and those could even be extended to just gamers and weebs in general. But I most definitely can't say that this is the case for all fans, and I truly hope that these are just a very, very loud minority rather than the majority. Because even throughout all of the issues and firefights and random discourses, there were always people and creators that helped remind me of the good in these communities, and how much fun it is to have people who can do the simple act of speaking well. To run back to Sonic again for a second, there was a lot of vitriol going on about the Sonic Generations half of Sonic and Shadow Gens, mainly its rewrites, and a lot of that was revolving around, you guessed it, Amy. Basically, any and all discussion that I saw at the time, which admittedly was fairly limited since I only saw the bits that randomly appeared on my feed. I didn't even realize there were spoilers, quote unquote, until later. But it just turned me off to the discussion entirely. Not necessarily because of what the people were saying, but how they said it. I opted to just avoid any and all discussion about it for the sake of my sanity after a short while. And yet, when the good buddy of LS Mark, Splash Dash, made a video about this very subject, saying nearly the exact same things that the people on Twitter were saying, not only did I fully understand where he was coming from, but I was much more receptive to the discussion as a whole, purely because he knows how to speak well. He didn't antagonize anybody, he didn't talk down to anyone, he didn't curse the name of Ian Flynn. He just stated his opinion and the state of things the way that I imagine any regular person both would and should, with respect. Across all fandoms everywhere, I feel like many of them wouldn't get half the negative reputations that they do if more people simply learned how to be more patient and willing to engage with the original material themselves to form their own opinions rather than parroting what's popular. to be more nuanced in discussions instead of shutting down anyone who says something they don't like. And most of all, to be more respectful of each other and to remember that there's another real person on the other side of the screen. It's then and only then that we can finally have a civil discussion about Amy again. God bless.